Hi, welcome to the 19th episode of Startup Strides. Today, my guest is Brooks Leitner. He is a recent MD-PhD graduate from Yale, who also is a co-founder of EpiTET Therapeutics, which we'll talk more about later. Welcome, Brooks. Really nice to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, Shavid. Excited to be here.
Brooks, I gotta say, I went through your, the resume that's available on your LinkedIn, and it's impressive. I mean, such a young age, achieving, doing so much. I really don't know how you manage your time to fit all of those things, but I'm gonna start from the very beginning, right? How did it all start? Where did the interest in medicine arise? Why you want to do MD PhD? Just tell me in your own words.
Yeah, totally. I wasn't super school oriented, growing up. Actually, I was I liked sports, and I only really applied to a couple college. I wanted to only apply to one, my home college, University of Maryland, but everyone's like, no, you have to apply to a couple. I was like, okay. Ended up going to University of Maryland anyway and studied kinesiology and was interested in exercise physiology. That's where I learned about biomedical research. So joined the lab looking at the effects of exercise on brain function. And so ended up doing that for a few years. And afterwards, I didn't know if I wanted to do med school or PhD. I hadn't met any physicians or anything like that. And I liked research. So I went to the National Institutes of Health. I actually volunteered as a healthy volunteer for the Clinical Metabolic Research Unit, where they studied diabetes, obesity, brown fat. And I actually stayed overnight, got a hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp. It's a long invasive test as the gold standard to measure insulin sensitivity. Got a DEXA scan to measure body fat. I was like, this is awesome. And I brought my resume while I was in the gown and said, I really want to work in this lab. And so that's the job I ended up taking. So I guess it worked. So then I worked a few years at NIH, met an MD PhD, and thought this is really cool. This guy's working on research with the thought in mind that this will improve patient health one day using that medical knowledge. And so after 3 years, decided to go to Yale for MD PhD, and really loved metabolism still. That's part of why I chose Yale. I really was interested in the work that Jerry Shulman was doing, who ended up being the chair of my PhD committee. I worked with his most recent postdoc, who started her own lab looking at how metabolism is regulated in cancer. And then COVID happened in 2020 when I was in my first couple of years of med school, started PhD pretty much remotely, ended up doing a lot of bioinformatics and data science, which has been fantastic. Just getting exposure to how to use open access data. And that's been great. And then ended up going back to med school, but feeling like I don't know if any of the research that I'm doing will actually help patients now that I see how the hospital works. And then in the hospital, I'm like, wow, medicine is so far behind where the basic science is. So that's what really got me thinking, what actually has to happen between scientific discovery and a patient in order to have this science benefit humanity. So that's where I stumbled upon, you need to commercialize a product and have it developed and go through the FDA and all of these things. So that's where I found startups. And that's where I learned about venture capital, because it's so much capital is required in order to get this commercialization happening from bench to bedside. You hear bench to bedside as a classic MD PhD, but they don't really tell you how to do it. It's kind of more theoretical. So I've been loving that world as I immerse myself into it, doing a couple of venture capital fellowships, getting some experience of how investors think, and then most recently co-founding EpiTET Therapeutics with a faculty member. So happy to talk about any of that.
This is really fascinating journey. It's very interesting. Some people really start with the idea of just doing medicine, and you just kind of just explore your way into medicine. It's really fascinating. Obviously I have a few questions to ask, but there are a lot of people, even from my own circle, I know that, debate whether to do MD or just PhD or MD PhD. Looking back based on your own personal experiences, how would you advise people to choose, between those degrees? And personally for you, was it the length of the time program was off-putting to you, or you didn't care about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question to be thinking about if people are thinking about pursuing an advanced degree. One thing I didn't realize about medicine because I just didn't really shadow any physicians other than physician scientists, is that it really is a profession, and you're trained to really understand guidelines, algorithms, like how to treat patients based on the discoveries that have been made for like the last 100 years. So it's not as much discovery. The practice of medicine is not as much discovery as I had thought it might have been. PhD is really, that's where that discovery is. But and I'll conclude on medicine. If you're considering it, it's very predictable. At least, it's a 4-year program. You have requirements. You have board exams, and you'll get to choose from many different specialties. So if you have any reason to really love medicine or field of medicine, it's very predictable and very interesting, very cool to work with a lot of people. I didn't like that it was as kind of fixed as it is. PhD is almost the exact opposite for many programs. Yale has very few requirements, which is great. And that's where you can just choose your own adventure. The plus side is that if you love flexibility, PhD to explore any particular topic that you want. I guess the minus side, which I actually liked, is that there's not really any one way to do it. And that can be pretty hard to figure out how to accomplish the PhD. But if you really like science, if you want to learn deeply about a topic, if you like reading papers, that's the kind of thing where you thrive in a PhD. The MD-PhD, the combined, is I really actually enjoyed that time where you think about problems that are translationally relevant, meaning that will actually potentially lead to how we treat patients in a clinical setting. But you really get a deep dive most of the time in a particular subject area. So you can really do kind of anything, and most people end up doing one or the other afterwards, some combination of both. But you really have that flexibility, which is nice. The duration of time is put off a little bit by the fact that almost all MD-PhD programs in the US at least are fully funded. So you're not paying for medical school. You get a small stipend throughout your entire time. And you can really work with an advisor if you really care about the timing to try to choose an advisor in a program in a department that has more flexibility in getting closer to 7 or even 6 years than traditional 8. So there's definitely flexibility there. But yeah, med school is almost very predictable, but you get a lot of access to patients. If you want to do clinical research, having your own patients is great. PhD, deep thinking, less guidelines. MD-PhD, longer, as you mentioned, but you can kind of pick what you want to do afterwards.
Got it. Before we start recording, you mentioned that you decided not to pursue residency. If you're okay with that, I would like to ask a couple of questions about that. What made you decide, because there's some people who end up in biotech and pharma, but they do it after they finish their residency. They're like, yeah, I know I'm going to go back to pharma, but let me finish my residency. But there's some people like you who decide to go straight into biotech and pharma. So what made you pursue that decision and not, do any of time of residency?
Yeah, definitely a lot of things. And I thought a lot about it. But I think that what helped me realize, when you say that, I was the only one of my graduating class to not do residency, at graduation. So it definitely is rare. But I looked back at what my application to medical school was, and I didn't actually say I wanted to be a physician, right? I wanted to be a scientist that worked on problems that improved patients' lives. And I never had any experiences that really drove me to want to be a practicing physician. And then when I got to med school, I realized I had no idea what it meant until, I actually saw what doctors do. And it's not something that I really wanted to do. So I had to think a lot about, what is a way that I could actually do what I want to do, which is more applied science, that I could also do residency. And it was just really hard. It's a long time. And this is what you're thinking about when you're choosing a degree program. It's a time commitment, and it might not be forever. The shortest one's 3 years. Physician scientist tracks are longer, 4 to 5 to 6 or more. But yeah, I realized that if I was going to use a period of training after my already, MD and PhD, I wanted that training to be in actually developing products that improve patients' lives, rather than doing the clinical training that you would use in order to treat patients, knowing that I never really wanted to do that. So it doesn't feel like a huge twist for me. It's different compared to other people. But I was able to just conceptualize it as thinking of residency as a training period, thinking of that 3 to 4 to 5 years as being a period of your time where actually immersing yourself, going up a steep learning curve and experiencing something. I just felt that this was a good path for me. And we had gotten accepted into an accelerator program for our company, nucleate activator program, which helped a lot, give us a little bit of traction. And it felt like it was a good time as any to actually just immerse myself in learning how to found and run a biotech and build it, and talk to lawyers, accountants, all like pretty much business plan, pitch deck, talking to investors, like all of that stuff. It's been pretty amazing. So I'd say, though it's not clinical training, it's training in its own right.
Okay. I can't wait to talk about your startup, but before we move on to that, I want to ask, because looking at your resume, you've had few venture capital biotech fellowships and internships. What were those experiences like? What were the major learning lessons, and how did your MD-PhD background come in handy? Because I know those things, especially when it comes to biotech, can be pretty research intensive. And what advice would you have for people looking to enter the space?
Yeah, I'd say if you're interested at all, by the way, it's awesome that you know about it. It took me a long time to even know about that world. And I will say just the general blanket advice is any small experience that can get you into that world will build upon itself slowly and slowly, so just get yourself started in any way, I think helped a lot. My foray actually was prior to those fellowships, taking an investing in innovation course in my last year of medical school. It's called Sci-City, Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale. And there I just learned, Jorge Torres taught the class, and he would bring in either an entrepreneur or an investor every week for the class. We were just exposed to what the world of entrepreneurship and investing was like. And that was awesome. And that we actually had some practical experiences, trying to build an investment thesis. And I was able to refer to that experience when I applied to the Canaan Fellowship Program and also the Hmong Impact Investment Fund. So even though it doesn't sound like, I'm getting in VC right away, I had some experience I could talk about that actually showed that I was actually interested in the space and had thought deeply about it. So that's my recommendation. Some of the lessons in those early experiences, Canaan is a giant multi-billion-dollar fund that invests in tech and biotech. And I was on, the biotech team. The biggest takeaway is learning what investors care about, because not every academic idea will be a great investment. And that was kind of news to me. It's like, oh, this Nature paper looks amazing. They're like, yeah, that would never work. I'm like, why? They're like, well, it's a novel target. It's like, maybe in 20 years, So thinking about that investors care about validation in different contexts and what risk means from actually putting down millions of dollars towards an idea and hoping to get returns back in a certain amount of time, knowing that they have to make those returns for their limited partners that give them the money. So the whole industry, that was my first foray into learning how investors think and why they do. And it's all so many things outside of what the science or the idea of the company is. So that was the biggest thing, is there's so much more than just science that goes into an investment idea.
Do you think advanced degrees like MD or PhD are necessary to be in that space?
I don't think it's necessary. I think it helps like to get that point, but experience matters more than anything. So if you really know you want to do biotech and you want to invest in biotech companies, the best thing to do is either work at a biotech company or invest in biotech companies. So and that matters more than any degree that you have. Obviously, you need to have a certain amount of background knowledge to actually understand what's going on. But if you have a chance, maybe out of undergrad or even out of high school, I know there's a program with biolabs where they get high school students in New Haven into the lab to actually do this bench science. So you don't even need college for certain programs. So that's why I think that experience matters more than anything else. A degree might help get your foot in the door, maybe have certain connections. But really, it's the amount of time and effort that you've spent thinking about a particular subject or content area that you're excited about is what will be transferable most. And for many people, a PhD or MD is a way to gather that knowledge in a structured way. but it's not the only way.
Got it. Now let's move to the most important part of our discussion. Your company, EpiTET Therapeutics, right? Am I pronouncing correctly?
Yes, yeah.
So tell me about it. Like, how did it come about? Was it based on your PhD project? And at what point did you realize this idea had a startup potential?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I started this before I knew much of anything,
Hmm.
but learned extremely quickly by doing, but also from the venture side almost simultaneously, and a lot through the nucleate activator program. But it started when I was working with the tech transfer office. It's called Yale Ventures at Yale. Um, and I got they had listservs of, hey, are there any students that want to help faculty prepare pitches for the Health of Women Summit? And I saw four pitches that needed help, and I was like, oh, this, Professor Huang, like this topic looks extremely interesting. Like, yeah, I would love to like do a market analysis, to try to help build this pitch deck. And so that was, last fall. So, maybe 9 months or so, 10 months or so ago. And, we helped her with that pitch fest, helped her with another pitch event. And we got a lot of feedback from investors after the pitch event in December. And there was a good amount of excitement. I knew that the tech transfer office was particularly excited about the IP, having, a novel composition of matter patent, being one of the stronger methods of protection, especially for building companies. So there was hearing the excitement, thinking about the idea myself. I actually was interviewing for physician scientist track residencies at the time because I hadn't closed that door. And I had been thinking a lot about what I think would be relevant in the future for the next 10 to 20 years. One of those areas was epigenetics, and the target that our molecule is targeting is an epigenetic target, a DNA demethylase. So I thought all of these combinations of, we have a patented small molecule, it's a degrader actually, it's in the target area of epigenetics. It lowers inflammation, which I think is another huge potential area. And I want to do this. So it was like a perfect story. And I worked well with the faculty member. We went back and forth for a couple months, and should we do something about it? Yeah, let's start raising money. They're like, well, it'd be great to just apply for grants and for try to get investors going. In order to get federal funding of any kind, you need to incorporate the company. And so that's what in February we actually incorporated. And that's when things felt real, when the IRS is sending letters to your house, and it's like, well, my house is the business address, so it's like, it felt like way more real. And then I'm like, okay, we really got to go in and do this. And fortunately, the last year of med school, there's almost no requirements here in order to allow for different experiences like this. So I was able to spend a lot of time actually working on it and doing the activator program. But it's changed a ton since the beginning. The technology has been the same, but trying to build a company around the technology, spinning something out of academia is definitely an interesting challenge that I've learned a lot about.
One thing I'm really curious about, because you mentioned it before in your previous answer, you said um, that there are some cool ideas that are just not meant for venture capital, right? And VC firms, like they're like, as soon as they look at ideas, they're like, yeah, it's not going to work. Your idea, was it because like you're doing something that you're interested in, but also VCs are showing interest, right? Was that a lucky coincidence, or did you just like navigate in that direction? Did you mold your research in that direction?
Yeah, and so I will caveat, we have not raised venture funding yet,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
which we've won a couple prizes. We have some non-dilutive funding, which is great. And like we won like this golden ticket, which is, we won the nucleate activator program. So that was, after a pitch, we won the Yale Innovation Summit golden ticket this year. So that's actually free office space for a year. So it's like we have some traction. We also, a research grant to the PI's lab just came in for 200K of money that has to go towards development. So it's not funding a salary yet. But either way, so we have some amount of traction, but no VC money. So we do get certain interest for different reasons. And that's an interesting thing that I'm learning about too, is that different VC funds and different stages of investment that VCs will invest in will have very different rubrics that they will use for consideration. And sometimes it's formal rubrics, sometimes it's not. But like pre-seed and seed investors are definitely willing to take much larger risks, knowing that that's an inherent part of investing in a company before there's been all of this validation. Whereas some giant funds that only invest Series B, Series C, wait until phase 1 or phase 2 human clinical trials have been completed before they put their money down. And then, so that's like the first layer of like getting investors interested, where, we've talked to some pre-seed and seed investors for several rounds, and a few have given really good actionable advice that we're working on now. But those are the people that have shown the most interest because they see the potential, but they're like, we just need it. There's some certain things that we can tweak. Some requires money, some doesn't. And so now we have a little bit of money. Hopefully we can address it with that non-dilutive, but the goal will be to try to be venture ready, and the other thing that we haven't really delineated who we should target yet is, the strategic interests of particular funds. So some are heavily therapeutics, so they only invest in drugs. Others are heavily cancer focused, for example. And other, so for example, we might actually just choose a fund based on those parameters that we actually want to target. And so then, yeah, go on. Sorry.
No. It's. I just want to ask a question based on that. And I know you're at the early stages of pitching and raising VC interest, but I've talked to some people, and some people say, you have to kind of adjust your pitch based on who you're talking to, and some people are like, you gotta just stay true to your pitch and to your idea, and just like let's see what happens, right? What's your take on that? Would you think what's your approach to pitching?
Yeah, that's so funny you mentioned that, because like I think you certainly need to have a sufficient N to actually a good sample size to be able to like feel confident in sticking to your guns. So the first, maybe like 10 investors that we were speaking to, mostly for feedback, sort of like they give different advice and almost directly conflicting. So you're like, okay, at least I know not to take advice from every single person on every single topic. And then the next maybe 10 people or so, you begin to hear the same things over and over. You kind of make tweaks that you hear as common things. And then, for example, people were really concerned about one particular aspect of the biology. And so I was able to do some open access data analyses in order to demonstrate the role of our target in the disease biology. And so that came up multiple times. And then now, okay, they just needed to see more strong clinical evidence. And we're not doing a clinical trial, but there are certain things that we can do in order to specifically address that component for sort of clinical early validation. So there are certain things that are like, yeah, we've heard this a lot. I should definitely try to change it. And maybe that even means changing your primary indication, which we went back and forth a few times, which is pretty hard to decide with like sort of a very broad therapeutic, for example. Other things like the brand and your style and whatever, I would recommend trying to embrace that. And I try to do it like a similar approach. I'm not like changing sort of like my vibe or interaction, or at least I haven't yet with particular investors.
Some people say that getting VC funding at the early stages, that like when you're just beginning, shouldn't be the first go-to move. You should look for like non-diluting like funding, like grant funding or whatever, so you can maintain your equity in the company, and then as you grow, you can get. At what point do you think it's smart to like try to look for VC funding to be able to like really expand your development?
Yeah, I think if I were to do it all, like, from either during PhD or a postdoc or something like that, try that over. I would definitely, as I'm working on the idea and like forming the pitch deck and forming the business plan, for example, try to get friendly advice from as many investors as possible, so that you'll hear comment like pressure test. So pressure test the idea with investors early, not necessarily asking for money, but say, where should I orient these next 6 months, 12 months? If you have time, the biggest issue is time. If you have time, definitely do the non-dilutive, find ways to do it. But for example, we're applying for an NIH small business grant, SBIR, on the September 5th deadline. If we're successful, the earliest we'd get that money is next May. So we couldn't even use that money until a year from now. So non-dilutive takes a lot of time, and there might be ways to do it. but it's fantastic. And that's what's supported us so far actually, is internal grants, either from certain Yale departments or from other non-dilutive sources. But I do think that getting VC feedback early, whether or not they're wanting to give you that money, and if an investor wants to give you a lot of money very early, it depends on what your product is. But I think many people would be inclined to take that, knowing that hopefully it also comes with a support network. Hopefully it also will get you tuned into different resources or other value that VCs can provide.
Got it. I want to talk more about the science behind your company, right? Obviously, don't disclose any IP information, any confidential IP-specific information. But I'm curious about the science behind your startup, and also how is it unique compared to existing solutions in the landscape, in the market?
Yeah. Well, so broadly, what our compound does, it's a small molecule degrader, so has good oral bioavailability, that actually targets an epigenetic protein that sustains chronic inflammation in macrophages. So it degrades the protein, completely causes transcriptional changes, at the transcriptional level, ultimately resulting in apoptosis of macrophages. And so any cells that overexpress this epigenetic protein that sustains this inflammatory program, we can induce apoptosis in those. And so why that's so cool is that inflammation, and specifically inflammatory macrophages, play a role in the majority of chronic inflammatory conditions. You also see immunosuppression in the tumor microenvironment. There are actually 2 recent science papers showing that taming inflammation with JAK inhibition enhances immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy. And that's one of the things that we're thinking about doing as well. So the concept is, if you can lower bad inflammation, you can enable, healing of either the body or enhance cancer immunotherapy. So why ours is unique is there are other companies that are working on eliminating macrophages, inflammatory macrophages, the same disease-associated macrophages or tumor-associated macrophages. But most of them are targeting cell surface receptors or proteins that are present on all macrophages. And that way you can actually induce sometimes immunosuppression. For example, CSF1R, colony stimulating factor 1 receptor, is also highly expressed on astrocytes in the brain. And preclinical models show that it can also eliminate healthy macrophages in the brain. So ours is unique in that it's specifically an inflammation upregulated process. It's really an epigenetic process. And that's what actually defines this class of inflammatory macrophages. So by specifically targeting those macrophages, and there's a second level of specificity based on the mechanism of action, our drug actually requires a second protein, an E3 ligase, for degradation, which is also specifically expressed in macrophages. So really, we're able to target inflammatory macrophages with 2 levels of specificity. And that's kind of what our unique differentiation is within that class.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Did you guys publish this research before you started building the company, or because of the IP stuff, or did you guys kind of just started as soon as there was a discovery, you started building a company around it?
Yeah, so actually probably the first paper is that will be really a good characterization. So the PI that we're working at, Dr. Huang, has published on the target and its role in disease biology for the last 5, 6, 7 years. Actually, this compound's efficacy, she only started recently working on, and probably the best characterized paper is under second revision out right now. So hopefully it should be published any day. But that's really showing with pretty good evidence. And actually, the interesting thing, it's some of the experiments that she had done, not only informed by reviewers, but also by investors that have wanted to see particular things, because not only does it make for a good investment, but actually it helped advance the science, which was, I thought, a pretty cool role of VCs.
Okay.
But yeah, so started working on it more recently. You'll see some publications soon.
But you guys patented it before you started publishing, right?
Correct.
Okay. And so what I'm interested in is, I was going to ask, is that, starting, actually, before I move on to that question, I'm curious. You said that you went back and forth on the indication on which you target. How do you guys end up focusing on cancer?
Yeah, so I'll say probably the two main indications that we're still sorting out are endometriosis, which is really increasingly recognized as a chronic inflammatory condition, led in part by actually the PI and the scientific founder, her boss, Hugh Taylor's department chair of OBGYN, has been, a pioneer in this space and has led phase 3 clinical trials leading to drug approvals in endometriosis. So having that as a reason to think, hey, if we have expertise, and he's now joined the SAB, that's something maybe we should lean into because we can uniquely offer a solution in this space. So that's one thing that helps, and she's demonstrated preclinical proof of concept in endometriosis. An issue is that it's a risky patient population where the FDA approved endpoint is pain, which is a subjective readout, which is a lot harder to actually specifically link the mechanism of drug in mice to actually showing that macrophage elimination will improve pain. And there's ways to do that, and we're working on trying to actually show that in as best way we can prior to the clinical trial. That's in part why we're trying to use AI to do patient subsetting based on particular multi-omic and multimodal features. So try to actually get the patient selection piece so we can identify the right patients that benefit from it. But it's hard, right? And so cancer, it's a new target, and these patients usually, so we'd probably be going after stage 4, so patients that have very few options or have failed other treatments. And that subset of patients, generally, they're potentially able to handle a higher level of toxicity, given that either their alternative is chemotherapy or they've actually failed chemotherapy. So for a new drug, that actually where we have shown preclinical efficacy, that might be a way to strategize that clinical plan. So kind of big picture, one thing that surprised me is how important it is to think of the phase 3 clinical trial, even before you've, potentially done it in animals.
Got it. Starting a biotech company while doing MD-PhD is one of the most challenging schools in the country. It's an insane fit to me. I'm not sure how you managed to do that, but what have been the most challenging aspects so far of, just because you're primarily a scientist and a doctor physician, which by training, but you have to look into like the law, legal parts of it. You have to know the finances. You have to reach out to investors. You have to do a bunch of other things. What were the most challenging aspects so far?
Sure. I would say first that I'd argue it's potentially easier to still be within the university ecosystem to get you a head start on being connected with lawyers, getting connected with investors, getting connected. So, and having access to particular databases that you might not have outside. So, which I realize definitely lean heavily into if you are in the university setting and thinking about building a startup. Probably the most challenging thing, though, that said, is actually finding the right people to talk to. I spent you could spend, there'd be, last week, for example, I had 8 meetings in one day, all with people I hadn't met before. And so I was trying to keep organized of how do I follow up with these people? What's the appropriate, and deciding, you just have to have a filter. First, you need to put yourself out there in order to make the connections that you need, because you just don't know how to do everything. But the second is trying to figure out what the filter is in order to follow up and make sure that, it was a good connection, and, you're actually just being a good person and stuff like that. So definitely tough finding the people and having a filter on how to move forward with that.
Yeah. Looking in the next 5 to 10, I know the average, amount of times it takes a drug to come to the market is 10 to 15 years. But let's just say looking at the next 5 to 10 years, what's your business model? What's your go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, so that's something. It's one thing I'll just emphasize. It's very important that I'm realizing is engaging pharma partners early. You really need, in order to develop a new drug, especially at the worldwide level. Eventually, it's you really need to be plugged into large pharma ecosystem, the experience, the ability to have these sites, these multi-site clinical trials, getting plugged in with pharma early. And so I think an essential part of our go-to-market is engaging with pharma partners early and deciding when it would make the most sense to get them involved. In terms, is it phase 1 or phase 2? We obviously have to do a lot of the de-risking ourselves, and that's kind of our mission, is to de-risk our novel asset sufficiently that it could actually be put into a system that could be distributed to patients. So that's kind of big picture, and ideally 10 years could be that sort of time frame. That less than that could be when that happens. But big picture, it's making sure we find all of the right people at the right time, from preclinical to the FDA IND enabling studies to phase 1 to phase 2, knowing that ultimately it will be distributed through large pharma in some capacity. So I think probably the key is engaging pharma partners early to help us make sure that we know exactly what that's going to look like and when. And that's something that we're doing now, still being early, but having conversations with, for example, we had office hours with Boehringer Ingelheim, which is based in Connecticut, to kind of give us feedback. So we look for those sorts of opportunities to make sure that our interests are aligned and that we're kind of benefiting mutually when it makes sense.
Do you think when it comes to market, a better long-term strategy, like eventually, would be to grow organically or to be acquired by like a larger pharma company to leverage their capabilities,
Yeah, so since we're not really a discovery platform,
Mm,
we have a single asset right now, and we have a chance because of its ability to reduce inflammation and potentially many indications. So we could actually modify some analogs of our compound, for example, to optimize for distribution in certain tissues. So we could actually have, for example, different sister molecules of our tool compound right now that could have different indications, and it could be sort of a platform in a pill. That would be one strategy. Though we're really focused now on determining how can we be the most likely to get this our compound approved and useful and effective for the first set of patients with a high unmet need. And so thinking about that strategy now, and because we have that thing, we're not really a platform and designed. It does look like the most common option would be to try to get acquired after a certain level of de-risking.
got it. You mentioned regulation a couple of times, and I know FDA is it's pretty hard, especially for considering you're affecting human health. It's no brainer. It's understandable. Uh, what are the main challenges? Like as an outsider, because I don't really know much about that process. What are the main challenges at each step when it comes to like to getting FDA clearance? And also, let's say you're developing your asset for one indication, but then you want to focus on a different indication too. Do you have to apply for a different kind of like regulation approval process, or do you just expedite it because they're already approved for one?
Yeah, well, you will see. So yeah, it's a complex that's a complex topic. Um, Fortunately, I'll say about early on, for example, like in order to get the investigational new drug, applying for the IND from the FDA, many companies, contract research organizations, have a very standard set of experiments for toxicity, for safety, for which might be accelerated with new AI tools. We actually might have a completely different process in the future. But right now, it's extremely standardized, which makes it very helpful because if you find a CRO, contract research organization, that you trust, they can guide you through that entire process that generates a data package that the FDA is going to want to see. So that's extremely helpful that these services exist, because many people are all trying to do the same thing to a very specific set of standards. As far as different indications go, generally you want to go all the way to, it depends on when you're acquired, if you're acquired, and what that company, for example, say you get it through phase 1 and the company that acquires you actually wants to use it for a different indication, that could theoretically be possible. But I'll just say something tangible that you could observe is that, say, a certain drug is actually FDA approved for ulcerative colitis, for example, you can skip a phase 1 trial and go right to phase 2 for psoriasis if it's anti-inflammatory. So showing that you've already cleared the bar for safety in humans. So there's definitely different strategies and ways to get to that more complex topic. But early on, I would say it's helpful to know that many people have gone through the process before, and the FDA having these rigid rules makes it relatively easy, actually, if you know them, to achieve those when you rely on people that know how to do it.
Got it. Just to circle back, you said you guys also focusing on cancer, but is there like a particular subtype of cancers that you guys really focusing on, or is it can be tailored for many different types of cancer?
Yeah, that's part of the strategy. I won't go too into now that we're trying to figure out as of this week is like, where do we start? Having preclinical efficacy in a single model, for example, but trying to see how does this fit into the bigger mission of the company is exactly what we're trying to figure out. So I won't go into too many details, but we have evidence that that anywhere in which macrophages are a prominent feature of tumors, and there's a few tumor types in which that appears to be more specific than others, are ones that we could target with our molecule.
Got it. One thing every time you develop a drug, you have to obviously engage several different stakeholders. So what strategies are you considering to educate key stakeholders about the benefits and effectiveness of your therapeutics? Because you always have to talk about efficacy and safety and all that. So what's going to be your approach?
Yeah, I think the first thing is knowing your audience. And maybe I should have prefaced this by asking you what your audience generally is. But having looked at, I looked at probably 5 or 6 of your guests in the past, and it looks like you're getting a VC, biotech, pharma sort of audience. So hopefully everyone's familiar. Knowing the audience. And for example, we're speaking with different patient organizations, and we'd want to emphasize very particular things for what patients really care about, and showing that we're thinking about that, how the pain being the readouts, like we're thinking about that even before we've tested this in patients, right? So we know that's what we're trying to fix, right? The government will want to know when we're applying for NIH grants. We have to educate them to like why their money actually will go towards something that's very likely to help people one day. And for VCs, we also want to show like why our company will produce a return for their investments. So I think knowing the incentives of your audience are things that we try to pay careful attention to when we're trying to devise how we communicate with these people.
Mm-hmm. Got it. I don't want you to repeat yourself too much, but just to summarize, looking in the future, obviously putting strict deadlines in the biotech is very hard, but I would like to hear if you have any future key milestones you want to kind of keep in mind when you're working on your company.
Yeah. You should come watch one of our pitches, I guess, and you'll see that in the final slide.
I will. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, generally and fortunately, these are relatively standard as well, considering we're preclinical. But we're hoping that there could be a clinical proof of concept in less than 5 years if we take the fastest route and we're able to obtain funding when we're hoping to. And that will be in part because a lot of this is very standardized. And so in order to try to meet that goal, what we're thinking about is raising enough money to achieve critical milestones, the first one really being the drug candidate. So what has actually made it through the rigors where we fully understand its mechanism of action? We've demonstrated proof of a preclinical proof of concept with that compound, done toxicity, done safety, all that stuff. Getting that drug candidate is really one of the key milestones. And then we just put it through the IND enabling studies. And so that's sort of that standard path that I mentioned. And then the really hard part then is designing that clinical trial in the most effective way and getting it to the right patients. And so some of those are relatively fixed milestones. A lot of it will depend on funding. And our fundraising strategy is ideally raise as much as you can so that you have enough wiggle room. So you don't run out. That's how you can easily miss that mark. But stay on track and making sure that you're engaging all these people at the next steps, even when you may not be there yet.
Got it. We're almost at the end of our episode, and it's been very informative. And honestly, from our brief interaction, I'm sure you'll be very successful. I wish tons of luck to you, Brooks. Let's get a bit personal. What's next for Brooks, right? You'll be working on this company. You're a CEO, so you'll be involved in every aspect of building this company. Tell me about what are your plans? Like once you manage to grow this company, do you want to stay in pharma? Do you want to move to the venture side? Do you want to start a new company? What's going to be? You have any things in mind or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think just as most of my career experiences have been, how I fell into MD-PhD is kind of just taking it one step at a time and kind of following those interests. Um, you know, that's the non-answer that I'll give you.
Yeah.
but definitely, I think what we're trying to do now is really build this team and realizing like, yeah, it takes a lot of people to actually take this across the finish line. And so as the team grows, and we get that expertise from the right people, to help us do the work that we need to do, I think that will kind of change the way that the company moves in the right direction. And I think it will be fun to see it go through different phases, because right now we're just scrambling all around, or I'm scrambling all around, slowly putting the pieces together, finding the right advisors, and actually getting a lot closer to where we need to be, literally in the last couple months. So I think it'll be fun to see how these phases change, and we'll see how much I enjoy being in it. And some of the other, I'll probably interact with players in many of the fields, whether it is investing, whether it is in biotech, whether it is in pharma. So we'll see a lot of that along the way.
Are you involved in hiring currently? Are you hiring people for your team?
We have a couple of PhD and medical students that are actually kind of working with us. We met a couple, including a couple during the nuclear program, really helped us out, Kenneth and Raina. And Kenneth has
Oh,
decided to stay on and continue working with us, which has been fantastic. As far as advisors, I'm like, yeah, we have a good set of advisors. They're on the pitch deck. They're currently CEO and CSO of another startup, each with over 25 to 30 years of experience, with multiple exits. So these are the kind of people that, I've been able to try to like recruit and say, this is a project worth investing in. And I've had some success with that so far. So that's definitely been one of my main missions, is trying to demonstrate that the science actually has that potential to make a difference in particular disease and conditions. And that's been essential to trying to get people to buy in and help us get to where we need to go.
advisors are essential when it comes to growing a company. What are your criteria when you look for advisors for your team, for your company?
Yeah, I think the hardest part, and this is like a general rule of life, is like figuring out what you want and figuring out what you need. Um, and so as soon as I figure out what I want or need, is then I can find those right people.
Mm.
Um, but I think like early on, like I'm just like, I need somebody that knows what they're doing, to be telling me to be advising. And that's what you realize too, is a lot of it is doing and then asking and doing and asking. So it's not so much when you're running these companies that somebody will give you the template, um, eh, as much as trying to go and move forward and then ask if that was the right direction. And then you can ask less frequently as you develop and bring more people on to distribute the tasks. But it's I don't really have a good answer.
No, no,
It's pretty fun.
it makes sense, and I hope it. Again, I wish tons of luck to you. I'm sure you'll be very successful. I guess, there's some people who watch this who are PhDs or who are aspiring PhDs or who want to, start their biotech company, work in biotech. What would you advise to aspiring entrepreneurs who want to be in your position or are in your position and want to start their biotech firm?
Yeah, get out there. Like,
Yeah.
go to networking events. Go to things like Nucleate. Go to like the innovation events at your university. Look online at, so for example, like Pillar VC, it's a venture fund that they're really friendly, gave us a lot of good advice. They have what's called a founders playlist online, and it's amazing. Tons of articles that you can just learn about startups. So I think just like learning, reading, being involved in the ecosystem. MD Plus, if you're in med school, is a great Slack group that I've gotten a lot of opportunities from, and I post opportunities there. Finding anyone else that's interested in it. There's Yale MedX. There's a couple of med students that tried to create an organization specifically for this person within the medical school at Yale. So Theo and Jem are trying to create an ecosystem. So try to find those ecosystems. And like, I think the other thing is that like, if you believe that you can do it, and that's something that you work on. Like before the pitch day, I literally was telling myself, I'm going to rock this, right? like believing in yourself and like taking that leap, I think is it may be cheesy, but I think it's extremely important. And definitely get out there, find the right people, and then if you want to be in that position, envision yourself in that position, and just do the things that people have done to get in that position.
Got it. Brooks, thank you so much for this episode. It was really informative, really helpful, and again, wish you a lot of luck. And I hope we can stay in touch so I can see the progress of your company. I'll up in the US. I'll probably be in London, but I'm still excited to stay in touch. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, Javid. It's been fantastic. I'm excited to see what you decide to do. It's you have an exciting future ahead of you.
I appreciate it, brother. I'll let you know. You'll know.
Definitely.
Take care.
Thanks, Javid. It's been great.
Same.